At 21, Jane discovered her uncle was secretly crossing a line, and her mother was involved. Jane was 21 years old when she realized the betrayal didn't come from one person, but from two people she trusted with her life. The two people who were supposed to protect her, the two people she called family. One was her uncle, the other was her mother, and what happened between them would shatter everything Jane thought she knew about trust, about safety, about the people who claimed to love her. This is her story. This story is shared for education and awareness. Please stay till the end because what happened next could help someone else recognize the warning signs early, before it's too late, before the silence becomes too heavy to break. Jane grew up in a small town in the Midwest where everyone knew everyone. She was the kind of girl who never caused trouble, who kept her head down and did what she was told. She was respectful, soft-spoken, and deeply trusting, maybe too trusting. Her father left when she was 7, and after that it was just Jane and her mother, Emily. Emily worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, and Jane learned early on not to ask for much. She learned to be grateful for what she had. She learned to stay quiet when things felt wrong because speaking up might make things worse. And then there was Uncle Michael. Michael wasn't really her uncle by blood, he was Emily's older brother, but he'd been around for as long as Jane could remember. He was the one who fixed things when they broke, who showed up with groceries when money was tight, who drove Jane to school when Emily couldn't. Everyone in the family called him dependable, generous, the kind of man you could count on. Emily leaned on him for everything, and Jane, well, she trusted him the way children trust the adults who show up. She never questioned it. Why would she? He was family. He was helpful. He was always there. At the time, Jane didn't know that trust can sometimes be used as a weapon. She didn't know that the people who seem the safest can sometimes be the most dangerous. She didn't know that the warning signs were already there, hidden in plain sight, disguised as kindness. As Jane got older, Michael's presence in their home became even more constant. He had his own apartment across town, but he spent more time at their place than his own. He'd show up in the evenings, sometimes staying until late at night. He'd bring cake out for dinner, help with household repairs, sit on the couch watching television with Emily like they were the ones who lived together, and Jane was just a guest. Emily seemed to need him in a way that Jane couldn't quite understand. It wasn't just about the help he provided. It was something deeper, something that made Emily anxious when Michael wasn't around and overly accommodating when he was. Jane noticed things that didn't sit right. The way Michael would let his hand linger on her shoulder a little too long. The way he'd comment on her appearance, not in a fatherly way, but in a way that made her skin crawl. The way he'd insist on hugging her goodbye even when she tried to pull away. The way he'd show up in the hallway outside her bedroom door late at night, claiming he was just checking to see if she was still awake. Emily never seemed to notice, or maybe she did notice and chose to ignore it. Jane tried to tell herself she was overreacting, that she was being paranoid, that Michael was just being affectionate in his own awkward way. But deep down, something whispered that this wasn't normal, that this wasn't how uncles were supposed to behave. And then one night when Jane was 19, Michael crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Jane had been in her room studying for an exam when Michael knocked on her door. He said he wanted to talk. He came in and sat on the edge of her bed, too close, his presence filling the small room in a way that made it hard to breathe. He started asking her questions, personal questions, questions that had nothing to do with school or family or anything appropriate. Jane felt trapped. She wanted to leave, but this was her own room. She wanted to scream, but Emily was just down the hall, and what would she say? What would she think? Michael's voice was calm, almost soothing, but the words coming out of his mouth were wrong. Everything about this was wrong. And then one night changed how Jane saw her entire family. That night, Michael didn't just talk, he touched her in ways that made Jane freeze. Not because she consented, but because her body didn't know how to respond. This was her uncle. This was the man her mother depended on. This was the man who'd been part of her life since she was a child. How could this be happening? Jane's mind screamed at her to move, to fight, to run, but she just sat there, silent, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might explode. When he finally left her room, Jane locked the door and sat on the floor, shaking. She couldn't make sense of what just happened. She couldn't process it. She felt dirty, confused, ashamed. And the worst part, she blamed herself. She wondered if she'd done something to make him think this was okay, if she'd been too friendly, too trusting, too naive. For weeks, Jane avoided being alone in the house. She made excuses to stay late at her part-time job. She spent hours at the library, even when she didn't have homework. She couldn't tell Emily. What would she say? Your uncle, the one who helps us with everything, the one you depend on, he crossed a line. Jane knew how that conversation would go. Emily would defend him. She'd make excuses. She'd find a way to make it Jane's fault. So Jane stayed silent. And Michael, he acted like nothing had happened. He still showed up at the house. He still sat on the couch with Emily. He still smiled at Jane like they shared a secret. And in a way, they did. A secret Jane didn't want but couldn't escape. But then a few months later, something happened that made everything so much worse. Jane came home early from work one afternoon and heard voices coming from Emily's bedroom. At first, she thought maybe Emily was on the phone, but then she heard Michael's voice too, and the tone was intimate. Too intimate. Jane stood frozen in the hallway, her stomach turning. She didn't want to believe what her mind was suggesting, but when the door opened and Michael walked out, adjusting his shirt, avoiding Jane's eyes, she knew. She knew. Jane didn't understand how someone she called uncle could ignore the word family. She didn't understand how her mother could be involved with the same man who violated her daughter. But what hurt Jane the most was the silence. The silence that filled the house. The silence that Emily demanded without saying a word. The silence that told Jane she was on her own. Jane didn't confront them right away. She couldn't. The betrayal was too massive, too overwhelming to put into words. But she started paying closer attention. She started noticing things she'd missed before. The way Emily would text Michael constantly. The way she'd get dressed up when she knew he was coming over. The way she'd send Jane out of the house on errands that didn't need doing. This wasn't new. This had been going on for a while, maybe years, and Jane, in her innocence, in her trust, had never seen it. Or maybe she'd seen it but hadn't wanted to believe it. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her mother, the one person she was supposed to protect, had been romantically involved with the man who hurt her. And worse, Emily knew. She had to know. There was no way she didn't know what Michael was capable of. One night, Jane finally found the courage to confront her mother. She waited until Michael wasn't there, until it was just the two of them in the kitchen. Jane's hands shook as she spoke. She told Emily everything. What Michael had done, how it had made her feel, how long she'd been carrying this weight alone. She expected shock. She expected outrage. She expected her mother to be horrified. Instead, her face went cold. She looked at Jane like she was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. Emily said Jane was exaggerating, that Michael would never do something like that Jane must have misunderstood, that she was trying to ruin Emily's relationship because she was jealous. Jealous. That word hung in the air like poison. Jane felt the ground beneath her give way. This was her mother, the woman who'd raised her, and she was choosing Michael. She was choosing the man who'd violated her daughter over her own child. Emily told Jane to stop making things up, to stop causing drama, to stop trying to tear the family apart. And then she said the words that would haunt Jane for years. If you can't accept that Michael is part of this family, then maybe you need to find somewhere else to live. Jane stood there, speechless, tears streaming down her face. She felt like she was drowning, like the walls were closing in. Her mother wasn't going to protect her. Her mother wasn't going to believe her. Her mother was complicit. And in that moment, Jane understood the full scope of the betrayal. It wasn't just what Michael had done, it was what Emily had allowed, what she'd chosen to ignore, what she'd chosen to prioritize over her daughter's safety and well-being. But what hurt Jane the most was the silence Emily demanded, the silence that told Jane her pain didn't matter, that her voice didn't matter, that she didn't matter.
Before we go deeper into Jane's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like Jane's need to be told. Awareness starts with listening. After that confrontation, life in the house became unbearable. Emily stopped speaking to Jane unless absolutely necessary. Michael continued coming over, acting like nothing had happened, like Jane hadn't exposed him. Sometimes he'd even smirk at her, a silent reminder that he'd won, that Emily had chosen him, that Jane was powerless. The manipulation was subtle but constant. Emily would tell Jane she was being dramatic, that she needed to get over it, that she was ruining everyone's lives with her accusations. She guilt-tripped Jane by talking about how hard things had been since Jane's father left, how Michael was the only one who'd stuck around, how ungrateful Jane was being. The message was clear. Jane was the problem, not Michael, not Emily, Jane. Jane started to doubt herself. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe she'd blown things out of proportion. Maybe she was the one who needed to change. This is what manipulation does. It makes you question your own reality. It makes you think that your pain is invalid, that your memories are wrong, that you're the one who's broken. Jane felt isolated, trapped, like she was living in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She had nowhere to go, no money saved up, no other family who would take her in. So she stayed. She kept her head down, she avoided Michael as much as possible, she counted the days until she could leave. But the damage was already done. The betrayal had carved itself into her bones. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, she couldn't focus on anything. Her grades slipped, she stopped seeing her friends, she withdrew into herself, building walls so high that no one could reach her. And all the while, Emily and Michael carried on like everything was fine, like they were the victims, like Jane was the villain in their story. And the worst part? The family knew something was wrong, but no one asked, no one reached out, no one questioned why Jane had become a ghost in her own home. Because in families like this, silence is the rule. You don't ask uncomfortable questions, you don't challenge the people in power, you don't rock the boat. And so Jane suffered in silence, carrying a weight no 21-year-old should ever have to carry. This is how it happens. This is how abuse survives. Through fear and silence, through manipulation and denial, through families that choose comfort over truth, through mothers who choose their own needs over their children's safety, and through victims who are told over and over again that their pain doesn't matter, that their voice doesn't matter, that they didn't matter. The effects of what happened didn't just disappear. They burrowed deep into Jane's psyche, reshaping how she saw the world, how she saw herself, how she interacted with everyone around her. Trust, once so natural to her, became impossible. She found herself questioning everyone's motives. If her own mother could betray her, if her own uncle could violate her, then who could she trust? The answer felt like no one. Jane developed anxiety that made it hard to leave the house, panic attacks that came out of nowhere, leaving her gasping for air in grocery store aisles and parking lots. She'd have nightmares where she was back in that room with Michael, frozen, unable to move or speak. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the terror so real she could taste it. And the shame was the worst part. Jane felt like she'd done something wrong, like she'd somehow invited this, like she should have been stronger, smarter, braver. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone damaged, someone dirty, someone unworthy of love or protection. This is what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones who hurt you. You internalize it. You make it your fault. You carry the weight of their choices as if they were your own. Jane started to engage in self-destructive behaviors. She drank too much, trying to numb the pain. She got into relationships with people who treated her poorly because she didn't think she deserved better. She sabotaged opportunities because some part of her believed she wasn't worthy of success or happiness. Research shows that family abuse, especially when it involves a trusted adult and a complicit parent, leaves deep psychological scars. Victims often struggle with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. They blame themselves, even though none of it was their fault. They struggle with feelings of worthlessness and shame, and many never report what happened because they know they won't be believed, because they've already been told their pain doesn't matter. Jane was living proof of these statistics. She was drowning and no one was throwing her a lifeline. No one was even looking. But here's what people need to understand about family abuse. It often goes unreported, not because victims don't want help, but because the very structure of their family prevents them from speaking out. When your abuser is someone the family depends on, when your mother is complicit, when everyone around you has chosen to look the other way, where do you turn? Who do you tell? The answer for many victims is no one. They suffer in silence because silence feels safer than the alternative. This is how abuse survives, through fear and silence, through manipulation and denial, through families that prioritize their own comfort over the truth, through systems that fail to protect the most vulnerable. Jane might have stayed trapped in that cycle forever if it wasn't for one person. Her name was Rachel, and she was a coworker at the coffee shop where Jane worked. Rachel was older, maybe in her 40s, with kind eyes and a calm presence that made Jane feel safe. They'd worked together for months, but Jane had always kept her distance, too afraid to let anyone get close. One day, Rachel noticed Jane crying in the break room. Instead of walking away or offering empty platitudes, Rachel just sat down next to her and waited. She didn't push, she didn't pry, she just made it clear she was there if Jane needed her. And something about that simple act of kindness broke through Jane's defenses.
Slowly, haltingly, Jane began to open up. Not all at once, but in small pieces. A comment here, a detail there. Rachel listened without judgment. She didn't tell Jane she was overreacting. She didn't make excuses for Emily or Michael. She just listened. And then she said something Jane had never heard before. What happened to you wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. Those words hit Jane like a tidal wave. For the first time, someone was validating her pain. Someone was telling her that her reality was real, that her feelings were justified, that she had been wronged. Rachel encouraged Jane to talk to a counselor. She even helped her find a free clinic that specialized in trauma. At first, Jane resisted. She was terrified of drudging up all those painful memories. But Rachel was patient. She didn't push, but she didn't let Jane give up either. Eventually, Jane made the call. She scheduled an appointment, and on a cold Tuesday morning, she walked into a small office and told a stranger the story she'd been carrying alone for so long. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Harris, listened with the same non-judgmental presence Rachel had shown. And then she said something that changed everything. You're not responsible for what was done to you, but you are responsible for what you do next. You have a choice. You can stay silent, or you can reclaim your voice. That word, reclaim, stuck with Jane. She'd been so focused on survival, on just getting through each day, that she hadn't realized she had power. She had agency. She had a voice. And it was time to use it. The realization didn't fix everything overnight. Healing doesn't work that way. But it was a start. It was the first crack in the wall Jane had built around herself. And through that crack, light began to seep in. It took Jane 6 more months before she felt ready to confront Emily and Michael again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Rachel came with her. Dr. Harris had helped her prepare, walking her through what she wanted to say and how to protect herself emotionally. Jane didn't go to the house. Instead, she asked Emily to meet her at a neutral location, a park bench near the center of town. Emily showed up late, her face tight with irritation. She didn't ask how Jane was doing. She didn't apologize. She just sat down and crossed her arms, waiting. Jane took a deep breath and began.
She told Emily calmly but firmly that what Michael had done was abuse, that Emily's refusal to protect her was a betrayal, that she would no longer accept being silenced or blamed. Emily's face went red. She tried to interrupt, to deflect, to make excuses, but Jane didn't let her. For the first time in her life, Jane held her ground. She told Emily that if she wanted any kind of relationship with her daughter moving forward, she needed to acknowledge what had happened. She needed to cut ties with Michael. She needed to take responsibility for her role in Jane's suffering. Emily stared at her, speechless. And then she stood up and walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence. That was the last time Jane saw her mother for 2 years. It hurt. Of course it hurt, but it was also liberating. Jane had set boundaries, she had spoken her truth, and she had refused to accept anything less than what she deserved. As for Michael, Jane never confronted him directly, but she did report him. Not to the police, the statute of limitations had passed, but to other family members. She told her aunts, she told her cousins. She made sure people knew what he was capable of. Some believed her, some didn't. But Jane didn't need everyone to believe her. She just needed to speak the truth. Slowly, Michael's influence in the family began to crumble. People started asking questions, started reconsidering their relationships with him, started seeing the cracks in the facade he'd built. It wasn't a perfect justice, it wasn't a courtroom conviction, but it was something. And for Jane, that was enough. Not all justice looks the same, but speaking out is power. It's reclaiming your story. It's refusing to be silenced. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do. Today, Jane is 27 years old. She lives in a different state now, far from the town where she grew up. She's still in therapy, working through the layers of trauma that abuse leaves behind. She's learning to trust again, slowly, carefully, one step at a time. She's building a life for herself that's defined not by what was done to her, but by who she's choosing to become. She surrounded herself with people who respect her boundaries, who believe her, who show up for her in ways her family never did. And she's speaking out. Jane started sharing her story online, anonymously at first, then with her real name. She wanted other survivors to know they weren't alone, that their pain was valid, that they deserved to be believed. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of messages from people who'd been through similar experiences, from people who felt seen for the first time, from people who were finally ready to break their own silence. Jane's story isn't unique. Family abuse happens more often than we want to believe. Research shows that in approximately 63% of child abuse cases, the perpetrator develops or exploits relationships with the family to gain access to minors. Studies have found that in many cases, the most frequent tactic used by abusers is the manipulation of the family itself. When a parent is complicit, when a family member enables the abuse, the damage is compounded. The victim isn't just hurt by the abuser, they're betrayed by the people who should have protected them, and that betrayal often cuts deeper than the abuse itself. Here's what people need to understand. Abuse can happen in families that look normal from the outside, in families where everyone goes to church on Sundays, where the lawn is mowed and the bills are paid, in families where the abuser is charming, helpful, dependable. Because abusers don't look like monsters. They look like uncles and neighbors and coaches and family friends. They're the people you trust, and that's exactly how they get away with it. Family loyalty should never come before protecting with truth. Family loyalty should never mean staying silent about abuse. Family loyalty should never mean choosing an abuser over a victim. And if you're someone who's been through something like what Jane experienced, know this: it wasn't your fault. You deserved better. You deserve to be believed. You deserve to heal. You deserve to reclaim your voice. There are people who will listen. There are resources that can help. and there is a path forward even when it feels impossible to see. It starts with breaking the silence. It starts with telling someone, anyone, what happened. It starts with refusing to carry the weight of someone else's choices. Jane's story is a reminder that healing is possible, that speaking out is powerful, that you can survive the unthinkable and build a life worth living on the other side. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think family loyalty should ever come before protecting the truth? What advice would you give someone in Jane's position? How would you feel if this happened to you? If you were in Jane's shoes, betrayed by the two people who were supposed to protect you the most, what would you do? These are hard questions, uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary. Because stories like Jane's aren't rare. They're happening right now in homes all around us. And the only way to stop them is to talk about them, to refuse to look away, to create a world where victims are believed and abusers are held accountable. Share this story. It might help someone realize they're not alone. It might give someone the courage to speak out. It might save a life. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Where are you watching from? Have you or someone you know experienced something similar? What do you wish more people understood about family abuse? Your voice matters. Your story matters. And together we can break the silence. If you found this video important, please like and subscribe. We share stories like this to raise awareness, to educate, and to let survivors know they're not alone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and most of all, thank you for caring, because that's how change begins, with people who care enough to listen, people who care enough to believe, people who care enough to speak out. Jane's story is painful, but it's also a testament to resilience, to the strength it takes to survive, to the courage it takes to speak the truth, and to the hope that even in the darkest places, healing is possible. Remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, reach out. Tell someone. There are hotlines, counselors, and organizations dedicated to helping survivors. You don't have to face this alone, and you don't have to stay silent. Your voice is powerful. Use it.